Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. For better or worse, celebrity endorsed video games have been a somewhat embarrassing staple of the industry for quite some time now. From the slightly more respectable and obvious sports stars becoming game franchises such as John Madden, Tiger Woods and Tony Hawk's, to rappers such as 50 Cent or the Wu-Tang Clan popping up as violent protagonists, all the way through to the likes of Kim Kardashian and Mary-Kate and Ashley having their own dedicated titles. Celebrity endorsed games are here to stay, and try as we might, they simply can't be ignored. Speaking of video games of this ilk, one such title, released all the way back in 1994, caused such a stink and has become the butt of so many modern jokes that there actually exists an entire website dedicated to tracking down every physical copy of it, for the sole purpose of destroying them and thus wiping them from existence. The game in which I'm referring to is obviously the infamous Shaq Fu. Personally, I don't think it is anywhere close to as bad as the internet suggests, but taking into account what a poor reputation the game has, it would seem a very strange practice for a company to resurrect this unbelievably hated title and make a modern day reboot of it, surely. But that's exactly what those weirdos over at Big D's Productions did with Shaq Fu. So that's right folks, today we're finally going to be dusting off the basketball and taking a deep dive look at the 2018 crowd-funded sequel that was ridiculously fully funded, then produced. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Shaq Fu, a Legend Reborn, a modern sequel that was even worse than the original. Yeah. Released in October of 1994 to the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, with Game Boy, Game Gear and Amiga ports coming out the following year, Shaq Fu was developed by the now defunct Delphine Software International and published by Electronic Arts. Most known for their highly regarded cinematic platformers which seem to take their stylistic and gameplay cues directly from Prince of Persia, Delphine would find huge success with Another World and Flashback. The French development team were a highly progressive and influential studio during the late 80s and early 90s, but a long period of inactivity when it came to releasing new games meant their mainstream appeal had waned somewhat by 1994. Shaq Fu was actually their direct successor to the immensely popular Flashback, which had been ported to just about everything capable of running it at the time. But the rise of polygons and 3D graphics in the intervening 2 years since its release meant that the public was starting to call on Delphine Studios' distinctive rotoscope based 2D art style. Although Shaq Fu plays in a similar way to other traditional 2D fighters such as Street Fighter and Fatal Fury and whatnot, it features very small sprites with a large amount of frames of animation. These miniature, fast moving sprites give the game a very frantic feel, but the overly complicated animations are not conducive for smooth controls, so gameplay actually feels sluggish and oftentimes unresponsive as a result. Despite Shaq Fu's less than stellar reputation, particularly in more recent years, it wasn't actually received that badly at the time of its release. I mean, it wasn't exactly winning any awards or anything, but the reviews were pretty mixed, with a decent handful of positive ones in there, praising the game's animation, and GamePro even going so far as to praise the supposed sharp controls. Respected magazines such as Games Master and Meme Machines were even giving it props, scoring the Mega Drive version as high as 81%. Even the lower scored reviews don't seem to be particularly scathing, although there were a lot of very justified complaints about various aspects of the game. Critics of the time didn't seem to think it was a product to be particularly ashamed of, and almost all of them could find some positives within. This of course may all seem a little strange, considering that Shaq Fu has subsequently become known as not only one of the worst fighting games ever made, but outright one of the worst games of all time. Could reviewers of the 90s have been so horribly wrong? Or is it another case of the internet hysteria turning a largely forgettable experience with an amusing license and silly name into a piece of meme culture? Whatever the case, such was the infamy surrounding Shaq Fu. An Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign was set up in March of 2014 to finance a potential reboot or sequel to the divisive one-on-one fighting game. A few Millhouse-style eyebrows were raised when a funding goal of just shy of $500,000 was set up to finance the potential Shaq Fu reboot. Not exactly pocket change. The game creators over at Big D's Studios had some pretty lofty ambitions when it came to porting it, with Xbox 360, Xbox One, PS3, PS4, Wii U and PC versions all being promised if the funding goals were met. Sounds good on paper, but not many people thought things would ever get that far. Many were even questioning whether this whole project was legitimate and not some sort of hilarious prank. Astonishingly, despite the skepticism, after less than 2 months online, the $450,000 goal had not only been reached, it had been exceeded by almost $25,000, which meant the Shaq Fu sequel that nobody really thought was going to happen, was going to bloody happen. Or that was the theory at least. Some became understandably concerned when the following 2.5 years yielded very little news on the game's development cycle, or potential release date. Radio silence was finally thankfully broken towards the end of 2016, when the developers confirmed that the Shaq Fu reboot was almost finished, but declined to give any kind of speculative release date. Around a month after the March 2017 launch of Nintendo's latest console, the Switch, a trailer hit confirming that it would also be coming to that platform. Things were getting real now, and the announcement that the new Shaq Fu game would be hitting store shelves in early 2018 made things official. The game a lot of people thought was a badly timed April Fool's joke was actually about to be released. The slightly unfortunate, although completely expected and rather inevitable news that the PS3, Xbox 360 and Wii U versions would be canned followed soon after. Unforeseen licensing issues delayed things a little, as supposedly several of the licensing agreements had to be completely reworked last minute to allow the game to still see the light of day. Thankfully, these problems were quickly circumvented, and Shaq Fu: Legend Reborn was released worldwide on June 5th, 2018. In an online interview for the gaming section of the Red Bull website, Big D's CEO, Matt Karch, went into detail about how the project came into existence. He states, "When I met Shaq, he told me he wanted to get back into games. I told him we couldn't do anything until we addressed the massively pulsing sore thumb called Shaq Fu." Rather than slap the giant basketball star's name and likeness on an all-new IP, the decision was made to keep the Shaq Fu franchise alive. The development team intended to do away with the stigma of the original game by creating a new enduring legacy with an all-new Shaq Fu, which was the main reason they decided to shift the gameplay mechanics completely. Karch told Red Bull, "There's no pretense from the team at Big D's that the first Shaq Fu was anything other than a disaster. We are dropping pretty much everything from the first game, but that element of cheesy absurdity. Oh, and we are keeping Shaq, of course." The team considered many different gameplay options before deciding on ditching the one-on-one fighting mechanic from the classic. Arcade-style side-scrolling brawler gameplay would appear in its place. We discussed other options, but I don't think anyone would have really cared about a Shaq shooter, said Karch. The team at Big D's felt that transitioning to a cartoonish, button-bashing beat-em-up was in keeping with the general tone of the original game and gave it the sort of spiritual sequel reboot vibe that they were going for. The main influences of this new game engine were supposedly Street Fighter and Devil May Cry, but it was also clearly stated that they were steering clear of the kind of violent content found in nasty little immoral games like Mortal Kombat. Thank goodness. Building on this Karch would comment, Shaq has a well-deserved reputation of being a good, family-friendly guy, and having him tote guns around doesn't really match his image. We will be going for more of an over-the-top thing than a gory thing. It seems the relationship between the development team and the man himself was pretty strong, as Shaq was very much on board with the project right from the off, even occasionally pitching in on the creative side of things. The former AEW and WrestleMania performer gleefully fronted the PR campaign for the game, going so far as to provide a personalised voice recording for everyone that donated $250 or more to the crowdfunding campaign. There has been some confusion as to whether Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn is a sequel or a reboot, particularly due to the contradictory statements made by both the gaming news media and the actual developers. It is definitely a reboot in the purest sense of the word, but semantics in these circumstances get confusing very quickly, so call it what you like. It is certainly the second Shaq Fu game, after all. Shaq, for example, himself was quoted in the press referring to the game as a sequel, while others refer to it as a reboot. If we are going to bitch about semantics for a moment, in what universe could we possibly consider Final Fantasy VII Remake a remake? As personally, I do not recall playing a game on the original Sony PlayStation that either looked or played anything like this action RPG for the PlayStation 4. Why was it not titled Final Fantasy Reboot Part 1? As the game is neither a remake of its predecessor, nor does it feature the full story of the original either. Those bloody misleading bastards. Tangents aside, A Legend Reborn takes place in an entirely different continuity to its predecessor, dubbed by many fans the Reborn universe, with the original game and its never-released sequel, Shaq Fu 2, occupying the Delphine universe. Despite the two games operating in different continuities, the crazy Kaori character from the OG game does pop up here in the reboot too. It seems Big D's wanted a bit more of a direct connection with the first game, so fans could more closely associate the two. It does seem a slightly strange U-turn given how keen the devs initially were to distance themselves from any of the original game's content, but I think this is possibly more of an attempt to cash in on the quirky car crash appeal that the notoriety of the first Shaq Fu generates. I'm not sure how profitable the market for hipsters that want to play the sort of so bad it's good games you might find in an AVGN episode is, but I suppose it's some sort of demographic. If I was a betting man, Shaq Fu backers were likely the sort of gamers who probably live in one-bedroom flat shares in Camden Town, London, or Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York. Bloody millennials, all walking around like they rent the place. They were probably chortling, ironically, as they played this game, as they choked on their gluten-free, non-dairy avocado on toast. So yeah, I am placing full blame for this one on the vegans. A Shaq Fu 2 seems like a stereotypical ironic thing that these rainbow-haired lunatics would help manifest into existence. So, what would happen when this nightmare inevitably became a reality? Well, upon release, Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn was not exactly met favourably by critics. It wasn't particularly panned or lambasted, but no one really seemed to care all that much either. What seemed to irk consumers, critics and financial backers alike was the alarming amount of promised features and content that was simply not present in the finished product. Both co-op mode and player versus player combat were pretty egregious omissions. What kind of beat 'em up released in 2018 doesn't have any kind of multiplayer whatsoever? The ability to customise your character and change his fighting style had also been promised but was nowhere to be seen. Ditto, the ability to play as the bosses that you have defeated in the game was nowhere in sight. Possibly the most disappointing is the tantalising promise of being able to barge through walls and smash enemies through destructible floors, uncovering whole new areas, X-Men Children of the Atom style. That actually sounds really cool and rather fun, but lo and behold, once again, that feature is nowhere to be found in the game. Oh well, at least we get the tons of varied enemies and levels we'd been promised, right? Well, no. There are hardly any enemy types, rather you encounter constant reskins and the 6 levels are neither varied nor diverse. Quite the opposite in fact, they are mostly all remarkably similar. It would be a bit of a stretch to call this Shaq Fu reboot a bad game. There's barely enough about it to even complain about. It's perfectly serviceable and functional. It just happens to be about as bland can get, with little reason to justify its existence outside of the novelty factor, and the fact that Shaq seems like maybe he might be a nice lad. Where the original game was ambitious but failed to live up to gameplay expectations, this new Shaq Fu was just boring across the board, with not even the meme factor being present that the original brought to the table. To say it was all bad would be a tad harsh, as Big D's seem to have gone all out to attempt to make their Shaq Fu reboot as funny as possible, with zany tongue-in-cheek humour being the order of the day. Those kind of quirky comedy stylings are certainly right at the forefront here, and are probably one of the game's main selling points if you like that sort of thing anyway. Some critics were quite positive about the comedic direction the devs took a Legend Reborn in, with several citing it as one of the game's few genuine positives, while others described it as childish, primitive and outdated. Kellen Beck, which I should point out is only a few letters away from Karen Beck, went one further in a Mashable review, when she criticised the game's humour for being offensive, repetitive and reliant on stereotypes. That might be a little bit harsh, but I can't really say in good faith that it isn't accurate. In an effort to get more miles out of the project, extend the length of the game, and no doubt get a few more cheap laughs, on June 28, 2018, a DLC expansion was released, entitled Shaq Fu, The Adventures of Dirty Barry, completely free for anyone who purchased a physical copy of the main game. Shaq Fu adds an extra 2 full levels, essentially artificially increasing the game's length from 6 to 8 levels in total. In a bizarre twist, players take control of a fictionalized version of former President of the USA, Barack Obama, as he travels through France and out of space in an attempt to take down a fictionalized version of everyone's favourite Messiah complex multimedia mogul Kanye West, who is amusingly called Kanye here. It certainly serves its purpose and definitely ups the wackiness to even more ridiculous levels. But it really is just more of the same. Shaq Fu is a neat little distraction, but it adds nothing to a Legend Reborn's legacy. Still, with enough of you pester me about it, I wouldn't mind doing a standalone Shaq Fu video in the future. The concept is that silly, in my opinion. Truth be told, there isn't much of a legend to be had. Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn is a novelty remake of a silly little game that wouldn't even be remembered were it not for the absurdity of the Shaquille O'Neal license and the internet gaming culture being fond of memes. Fair play to Big D's for making their quite frankly unrealistic dream a reality, but the fact is, no one is going to remember this game in a few years and no one really cares. It's all well and good making a quirky little game for quirky little hipsters, but if the entire project is reliant on ironic novelty with absolutely no substance, then what is the bloody point of Shaq Fu: A Legend Reborn? Who would have thought a Shaq Fu sequel would bring even less to the table than the original? So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Shaq Fu 2. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of today's video, and if you are aware of any other further ironic hipster curiosities that you feel deserve to be spotlighted on this channel. If you are new here, don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. And if you fancy it, why not check out my video on the original Shaq Fu game, where I go into detail and explain why the video game is nowhere near as bad as its reputation suggests. Videos like this are in part made possible due to the generous people who support my work over on Patreon. Speaking of my lovely backers, special shout outs go out to A Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, Heo, Paula Lopez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Coriomar Senior, Ron Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Azar Arkai, Dropkin Varela, Michael Calix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Johnny Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, Sang Hee, Norma Stitz, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Louis Viant, John Bates, David Bale, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, Steve, Awesome Jacket Dude, and everybody else who backs my work over on the Patreon platform. Thank you for being a part of the most exclusive club on all of YouTube. But anyone can join, so is it exclusive really? So just shut the hell up and become one of my Patreon backers. That'd be much appreciated. Thank you. Bye.